You have to tell the investigators that we were together that night. And we spent the evening together. You have to.
She worked 3 jobs. She skipped meals so he could eat. She took the blame for things she never did. She stayed silent when the world told her to speak. And she did all of it. Every single ounce of pain, every sleepless night, every dollar she never spent on herself, every dream she quietly folded up and tucked away where no one could see it. For one reason. Her son. Just her son. Because from the moment that boy took his first breath in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and cold fluorescent light, Diane Carter decided that his life would not look like hers. It would not carry the weight she had been handed. It would not begin where she had begun. Whatever it cost her, and it would cost her everything, Marcus was going to make it. That was the promise. That was the only promise that ever mattered to her. But what no one knew, not her neighbors who waved at her every morning from across the fence, not her pastor who prayed over her every Sunday, not the women she worked alongside at 2 in the morning, wiping down counters in a building full of people who never noticed her face, not even her own mother, who had raised her to be strong and silent in equal measure, was the secret Diane had been carrying for 11 years. A secret so heavy, it had reshaped the way she walked, the way she smiled, the way she answered simple questions like, "How are you doing?" with a practiced automatic, I'm fine, thank you for asking." She was never fine. Not once in 11 years was she actually fine. But she had become so good at the performance of fine that even the people who loved her most had stopped looking closely enough to notice. And that performance, that silence, that 11-year-long act of survival disguised as ordinary living is where this story really begins. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because stories like this one, the ones that don't make the front page, the ones that happen in quiet kitchens and ordinary neighborhoods, these are the stories that deserve to be told. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Her name was Diane Carter, 43 years old, single mother, church volunteer on the 3rd Sunday of every month, the kind of woman who remembered every neighbor's birthday and always brought a covered dish to the block cookout even when she could barely afford the groceries. The kind of woman who said yes when everyone else said they were too busy. The kind of woman that communities run on, invisible, indispensable, underestimated at every single turn. She lived in a quiet subdivision on the eastern edge of Augusta, Georgia, in a modest 3-bedroom house she had bought on her own, after 12 years of sacrificing every comfort she might have wanted for herself. The house had a small front porch, and a rose bush she planted the year Marcus started kindergarten. And she loved that house, the way people love the things they bled for. Her son, Marcus Carter, was 12 years old, bright, quiet in the way that deeply observant children are quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they are always watching, always filing things away, always understanding more than the adults around them realize. His teachers called him a natural. His school counselor wrote in one evaluation that Marcus had exceptional emotional intelligence and a rare capacity for analytical thinking. He made the honor roll 4 semesters in a row. He played clarinet in the school band. He was, by every possible measure, exactly the kind of child Diane Carter had spent everything she had to produce. And she was not done yet. But there was a man. There is almost always a man in stories like this one. His name was Raymond Cole. And Raymond Cole was the answer to every question this story is going to ask you. Who was threatening her? Raymond. What was she hiding? Raymond. Why did she keep her mouth shut for 11 years when speaking might have set her free? Because of what Raymond had told her he would do if she ever did. The question that is going to take us the next hour to answer, the one that kept investigators awake, the one that divided the community, the one that Marcus himself would not fully understand until he was old enough to carry it, is this. How does a woman as strong as Diane Carter end up so completely in the grip of a man like Raymond Cole? And when she finally broke free, what did it cost her? Diane Carter was born in Augusta, Georgia, in the spring of 1980. She was the 3rd of 5 children raised by a woman named Gloria Carter, who cleaned other people's houses for 31 years and never once complained about it in front of her children. Gloria Carter believed in 2 things above all else: God and education, and she raised Diane and her 4 siblings with those 2 things as the fixed points around which everything else orbited. You went to church, you did your homework, you did not bring trouble into this house. Those were the rules, and they were not negotiable. Diane was the reader in the family. From the time she was 8 years old, she would walk to the public library on Saturdays with a canvas bag and come back with as many books as they would let her check out at one time. Her older brother Terrell called her the professor. Her mother called her my serious one. Her 3rd grade teacher, a woman named Mrs. Annette Pickford, pulled Gloria Carter aside at a parent-teacher conference and told her, quietly but with complete sincerity, that her daughter had the kind of mind that only came along a few times in a career of teaching, and that she needed to be nurtured and challenged, because if she wasn't, she would spend her whole life underperforming what she was actually capable of. Gloria Carter cried on the way home from that conference. She never told Diane why. By the time Diane got to high school, she had a plan. A clear, detailed, specific plan. The kind that only people who are afraid of the alternative construct with such precision. She was going to study communications or social work. She was going to be the first person in her immediate family to earn a 4-year degree. She applied to 4 universities. She got into 3 of them. She received a partial scholarship from Albany State University, and with her mother's help and a federal grant and a work-study arrangement, she enrolled in the fall of 1998, full of the particular fire that belongs to people who have been told their whole lives that they are capable of more. She was 18 years old, and she had a canvas bag full of books and a plan, and a mother who had cried in a parking lot about her because a teacher had said her name and meant it as a compliment. She had every reason to believe she was going to make it. She lasted 18 months, not because she failed. Her grades were strong, her professors liked her. She was exactly the kind of student every university claims to want, but rarely knows how to keep. She left because of Raymond Cole. She was 19 when she met him. He was 26. He had a car, a job, and a way of making you feel like the most important person in any room he walked into that Diane had simply never encountered before in a man. He was not from Augusta. He had come to work in logistics at a warehouse outside the city, and he had moved into an apartment 2 blocks from the campus and started showing up at the places where college students gathered. And that is where Diane first saw him, on a Friday evening in the early spring of her freshman year. And something about him caught her in the way that things catch you before your judgment has had a chance to arrive. Raymond was charming in the particular way that requires almost no effort. It was just how he was built, the way some people are built, to make you trust them before you have had the chance to think carefully about whether they have actually earned it. He bought Diane coffee. He remembered small details she had mentioned in passing weeks earlier. He showed up when he said he would, which was not nothing, which is, in fact, the oldest and most effective trick in the world. Simply doing what you say you will do, because it makes you look extraordinary in a world where most people don't. He was, in those early months, everything she had never had from a man. And she was 19, and far from home, and she let herself fall. And by the spring of her sophomore year, she was pregnant. Raymond Cole's plans had never once included her. He didn't disappear. That was the thing about Raymond that made him so difficult to explain to people who asked why she didn't simply leave. He stayed, but he stayed on his own terms, in his own way, showing up when it suited him and receding when it didn't, present enough to feel like a relationship, and absent enough to leave her carrying everything alone. He contributed almost nothing financially. He was inconsistent with the baby to the point of cruelty, the kind of inconsistency that is almost worse than full absence because it keeps the door open just enough to make you wait for something that is never coming. But he never fully left, and in the absence of his full departure, Diane, who had grown up watching her mother hold everything together alone, and who had inherited that same terrible competence, picked up every piece he dropped and carried it herself. She left Albany State at the end of her sophomore year. She moved back to Augusta. She moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in the neighborhood she had spent her entire childhood, quietly determined to leave. She had Marcus in October of 2000, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and fingers so small she couldn't stop counting them. She held that baby boy in a hospital bed at 2 in the morning with no one beside her, because Raymond had not come, had offered some excuse she had already stopped believing even as he said it. And she looked at Marcus and she made him a promise. She said it out loud, into that quiet room where no one could hear her except the child who was too new to understand the words, but who would spend the next 12 years being shaped by them. She said, "You are going to have everything I didn't. I don't care what it takes. I don't care what I have to do. You are going to make it out." That promise would define the next 12 years of her life. Every decision she made from that moment forward, including the ones that would eventually put her in serious legal danger, was made in service of it. Raymond Cole was not, by any simple definition, easy to understand. He was not the kind of man who announces himself as dangerous. He did not arrive with visible warning signs, at least not the kind that are obvious to a 19-year-old woman who has never encountered a person built quite like him. He was intelligent, genuinely, functionally intelligent, and he used that intelligence the way a very particular kind of person uses it, not to build anything lasting, but to identify and exploit the vulnerabilities in the people around him, with a precision that is almost easier to admire than to condemn, because at least it takes a certain kind of discipline. He understood people. He understood what they needed, what they feared, and, most critically, what they would do to avoid losing the thing they loved most. Over the years, investigators would come to understand that Raymond Cole had a pattern. It was not accidental, it was not situational, it was deliberate and consistent, and it had played out in some recognizable variation across multiple women in multiple cities over more than a decade. He found women who were under pressure, women who had children, women who had something to lose, and who had already demonstrated, through the ordinary circumstances of their lives, that they would sacrifice themselves to protect it. He would establish a relationship, not always romantic, sometimes just social, sometimes professional, and then he would make himself useful just long enough for the relationship to feel necessary. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he would begin to make demands. Small ones first, things that were uncomfortable but not impossible, then larger ones. And by the time the demands became truly dangerous, the woman in question had already said yes to enough smaller things that the threshold for the bigger ask had been quietly, methodically lowered, and she often couldn't even fully articulate to herself how she had gotten there. With Diane, Raymond had two leverage points that he returned to again and again across 11 years. The first was Marcus. Raymond was Marcus's biological father, and despite contributing almost nothing to the boy's upbringing, he reminded Diane on a semi-regular basis that he had legal rights, that he could petition for custody, that he could make things complicated, that courts were not always as sympathetic to single mothers as people like to assume. None of this was particularly likely to succeed if challenged in an actual courtroom. But Raymond knew, with the precision of someone who had studied Diane carefully, that the mere possibility of a custody battle, the disruption it would cause, the cost, the fear of what the proceedings might do to Marcus emotionally, the terrifying uncertainty of handing your child's future to a system that didn't know either of you, was enough to keep her compliant without ever having to actually follow through. He never had to do anything. The threat was the thing. The threat was the entire instrument. The second leverage point was something Raymond had discovered about Diane early in their relationship and had quietly kept filed away like a card he was saving for the right moment. When Diane was 22, working her first full-time job at a small insurance office in Augusta, she had covered for a coworker who had been stealing from petty cash. She had not stolen anything herself. She had not even been fully aware of what her coworker was doing at first. But when the situation came to light internally, she had, under pressure, frightened, and without anyone advising her, told the company's HR director that she had seen nothing irregular, which was not true. Nothing was ever prosecuted. The coworker was quietly let go. The matter was internally resolved. But Raymond had somehow learned about it, in the way that Raymond seemed to learn everything about the women in his orbit, and he had held it over Diane in exactly the same calibrated, low-heat way he held everything. Not loudly, not constantly, just enough that she knew it was there, just enough that she understood, without him ever needing to say it directly, that there were things he could do with that information if she stopped cooperating. This is how coercive control actually works, and it is important to understand it, because most people imagine it looks like something louder. Most people imagine threats are delivered at high volume, that fear is obvious, that a woman who is being controlled looks visibly frightened or visibly beaten. But the most effective form of control is not the one that makes noise. It is the one that operates so quietly, over such a long period of time, through such carefully calibrated increments, that the woman inside it cannot always fully articulate to herself or to anyone else that what she is experiencing is a system someone has deliberately built around her. Diane Carter was not a weak woman. She was one of the most capable, disciplined, resourceful women in this story, and she was controlled by Raymond Cole for 11 years because he was very good at what he did, and because she had a 12-year-old boy she was not willing to risk, and because sometimes intelligence and strength are not sufficient armor against someone who has decided to make you a target and has had years of practice doing exactly that. It was a Tuesday in October of 2012. Marcus was 12 years old. He had finished his homework and was asleep in the back bedroom with his clarinet case propped against the wall and his sneakers lined up at the door the way Diane had taught him. She had always said that the way you treat your shoes tells the room who you are. She was in the kitchen packing his lunch for the next day when she heard the knock. It was not a gentle knock. It was 3 sharp, deliberate raps that she felt in her chest before she consciously registered hearing them in her ears. She knew before she opened the door. She told investigators later that she always knew when it was Raymond, that there was something in the quality of his presence, even through a closed door, that her body had learned to recognize the way you learn to recognize the sound of bad weather before it arrives. Not by seeing it yet, but by a change in the air, a shift in pressure, something that registers below the level of conscious thought. She opened the door, and he was standing on her front porch under the yellow porch light, and she could tell immediately that something was different tonight. His jaw was tight in the particular way it got when he was calculating rather than simply existing. His eyes were moving too fast, landing on things without really seeing them, the gaze of a man who is running numbers in his head while his face tries to look normal. He had been sweating, even though the October air was cool enough that Diane had been thinking about getting Marcus a heavier jacket. He stepped inside without being invited, the way he had always done, and she moved aside to let him pass, the way she had always done, and he walked to her kitchen, the room she had painted herself, the table she had refinished with her own hands, and sat down across from the chair where Marcus ate breakfast every morning. And he told her what he needed. He was being investigated. A business matter, he called it, with the particular breezy vagueness of someone who has long since stopped associating shame with the things they do. He needed her to provide him with an alibi. He needed her to tell the investigators who would eventually come to her door that he had been at her house on the night of October 3rd, that they had spent the evening together, that she had seen him, that she could vouch for him. He laid this out flatly, not framing it as a request, not asking whether she was willing, simply delivering it the way a person delivers information they already consider settled. Because for Raymond, by the time he said anything out loud, it was already settled. That was the thing about him. Diane sat across from him and said nothing for a long moment. She looked at this man who had never once shown up for Marcus's school performances, who had arrived drunk at the boy's 9th birthday and made him cry in the bathroom, who had not paid child support without a court order since Marcus was 3 years old. And she felt something she had spent years trying not to feel, because feeling it made everything harder. She felt the full weight of everything he had taken from her. Not just money, not just time, not just the practical, countable things. The scholarship, the degree, the version of herself she had been at 18, walking across a campus with a canvas bag full of books and a plan that she had believed in completely. The girl who had won 3 essay contests and had a teacher cry in a parking lot about her future. She felt the loss of that girl sitting at her own kitchen table at 10:30 on a Tuesday night, and it was a different kind of grief than anything she had felt before, because it was the grief of understanding exactly how you got somewhere you never intended to go. And then Raymond looked toward the hallway at the end of which Marcus was sleeping. He did not say a word. He did not gesture. He simply looked in that direction for a moment, and then he looked back at Diane, and she understood. She had always understood how Raymond communicated the things he was not willing to say aloud. They had 11 years of practice at that particular language, and this sentence, delivered with nothing but a glance toward a sleeping child, was the clearest thing he had ever said to her. She said yes. She said it quietly, without drama, without tears, the way you agree to something that has already been decided before you were asked. Raymond nodded once, stood up from her kitchen table, and walked out the front door, and Diane sat in her kitchen for 45 minutes after he left without moving, not crying, not on the phone, not praying, which was something she almost always did when things were hard. Just sitting with the particular stillness of someone who has just made a decision they cannot undo, and who needs a moment to fully understand what they have done. Then she got up. She finished packing Marcus's lunch. She set her alarm for 5:15. She went to bed. Now here is what Raymond had not told Diane. What he could not have known she would eventually discover. He had visited 2 other women that same night before coming to her. A woman named Cheryl Watkins, 41 years old, 2 daughters, a connection to Raymond through a former workplace, had been his first stop. She had said no. His second stop had been a woman named Sandra Odom, 38 years old, who had known Raymond through a mutual friend for several years. Sandra had told him she needed to think about it, which Raymond had interpreted as a soft yes, which is not at all what it was, because what Sandra Odom did, instead of sleeping on it, was call a friend who happened to know a detective, and that phone call, made at 11:47 that Tuesday night in October, while Raymond was probably already asleep somewhere, feeling like the evening had gone reasonably well. That phone call was the first stone dropping into the water, and the ripples were already moving toward Diane Carter before she woke up the next morning to make her son's breakfast. The Augusta metro area is not a large city, but it is not a small one either, and the investigators who had been building a case against Raymond Cole had been doing so for 14 months before that Tuesday night in October. What began as a financial fraud investigation, Raymond had been systematically skimming money from a logistics operation he managed, rerouting small amounts across multiple transactions in a pattern carefully designed to avoid detection, had expanded significantly over the course of those 14 months as detectives began to understand that the financial fraud was, in a sense, the least interesting thing about Raymond Cole. The more they looked, the more they found. A man who had constructed his entire adult life around the exploitation of other people's vulnerabilities, a network of compromised relationships stretching across years and cities, a method so practiced and consistent that it had become almost invisible through its own repetition. The lead investigator was a detective named Gary Holloway, 20-year veteran, reputation for patience and for following threads long after other investigators had decided a thread wasn't worth the time. Holloway had known for months that financial charges alone would not be sufficient. What he needed was testimony, first-hand accounts of Raymond's methods from people who had been inside his orbit, who understood how he operated and what he was willing to do to protect himself. When Sandra Odom's call came in through his contact on a Wednesday morning, Holloway recognized immediately what he had. By Thursday, Sandra was sitting across from him in an interview room. By Friday, his team had begun a quiet, careful canvass of the other women Raymond was known to have relationships or dealings with. Cheryl Watkins came in voluntarily the following Monday, and what she told him added another layer to a picture that was already disturbing in its clarity. The knock came to Diane Carter's door the week after that. Not Raymond's knock, a different one entirely. Measured, professional. 2 deliberate taps and then a pause. She opened the door and found 2 people standing on her porch with identification and quiet, carefully neutral expressions, and she stepped back and let them in, because she understood in that moment that this was not a situation in which she had a meaningful choice about the next few minutes. Holloway was careful with her. He had been doing this long enough to understand that the women in Raymond's orbit were not the story. Raymond was the story, and that the fastest, surest way to lose their cooperation was to walk in treating them like suspects. He asked measured questions. He listened more than he spoke. He gave her room. And Diane, trained by 11 years of protecting herself inside Raymond's system, gave him almost nothing. She confirmed basic facts. She deflected others. She provided the alibi Raymond had requested. She placed him at her home on the evening of October 3rd, said they had spent time together, said she remembered it clearly, and she delivered all of it with the composed, unhurried certainty of someone who has rehearsed a thing enough times that it no longer feels like what it is. Holloway wrote in his report that evening that she had been cooperative in manner, but carefully limited in substance. He gave her his card. He thanked her for her time. He left. What Diane did not know was that Raymond's phone had pinged 3 cell towers on the night of October 3rd, and none of them were within 4 miles of her neighborhood. A gas station camera 12 miles from her house had recorded his vehicle at 8:47 in the evening. A resident on a street he had no business being on had doorbell camera footage with a clear timestamp of 9:14, and the vehicle in that footage was Raymond's. The alibi she had provided was not just contradicted, it was comprehensively, documentarily destroyed. Holloway had known this before he knocked on her door. He had gone to the interview to see what she would do, and now he knew, which meant that for the next 6 weeks, Diane Carter was not categorized as a victim in the investigative file. She was a potential co-conspirator, she was a suspect, and she had absolutely no idea that this was how she was being seen. Those 6 weeks were among the most surreal of Diane Carter's life, and given everything her life had contained, that is not a small thing to say. She continued working, all 3 jobs, the early morning cleaning shift, the afternoon cashier position, the weekend home health aide work she had been doing for 4 years for an elderly woman named Mrs. Patricia Fulton who had no one else. She continued driving Marcus to soccer practice on Thursday evenings. She continued sitting in her regular pew at Mount Calvary Baptist on Sunday mornings, singing the hymns she had known since childhood, shaking the hands of people she had known for years, smiling in the particular way she had perfected that was warm enough to satisfy and closed enough to protect. She received a second interview request from Holloway and attended it with the same careful composure she had shown in the first. She continued, in every visible respect, to be exactly the person she had always been. And in the back of her bedroom closet, behind a cardboard box of Marcus's baby clothes she had never been able to bring herself to donate, there was a shoebox. An ordinary shoebox from a pair of work shoes she had bought 3 years earlier. And what was inside it was about to change everything. Investigators found it on a Wednesday morning in late November. They had obtained a limited search authorization based on the alibi contradiction, and Holloway's team moved through Diane's house professionally and methodically, as Diane sat at her kitchen table with her hands folded in her lap and watched them work with the stillness of someone who has made peace, ahead of time, with whatever is about to happen. She was not under arrest. She had been informed of her rights. She had declined an attorney, which Holloway privately thought was either one of the most courageous or one of the most unwise decisions he had seen in 20 years, and he genuinely could not determine which. His team went through the house room by room. They were in the back bedroom for 11 minutes before a younger detective on his team, a man named Marcus Reeves, the same first name as Diane's son, a coincidence that would stay with Reeves for a long time afterward, emerged from the hallway carrying an ordinary shoebox. He brought it to Holloway at the kitchen table. Holloway opened it, and what he found inside stopped him in a way that very little had stopped him in 2 decades of this work. There were text messages, hundreds of them, printed on paper and dated in Diane's neat, precise handwriting. There were voicemail transcriptions. She had listened to Raymond's voicemails and typed out every word, verbatim, and written the date and time at the top of each entry. There were handwritten notes, time-stamped with dates and sometimes the specific time of day, describing individual interactions with Raymond, the exact words he had used when he referenced Marcus, the exact phrasing he had used when he referenced the insurance office incident, the specific nature of each demand he had made, and the specific circumstances under which he had made it. There were photographs she had taken on her phone and printed, images of objects Raymond had left at her house that she had, by some quiet instinct, documented without fully knowing why she was doing it. There was a timeline, not the organized, structured document a lawyer would produce, but the kind of accumulated record that a person produces when they have been paying very close attention for a very long time, and writing things down, because writing things down is the only form of control the situation allows. The earliest entry was dated December of 2001. Marcus had been 14 months old. Diane had written, in pencil on a piece of notebook paper, with the careful handwriting of someone making sure it would still be readable years later, R came tonight. Said if I told anyone about the money situation he would take the baby. Said he had a cousin who was a lawyer. Said no judge would give a baby to a woman who was known to lie to her employer. She had written those sentences down, folded the paper, and put it in the box. She had been 21 years old. Marcus had been 14 months old, and she had already understood enough about the situation she was in to start keeping records. For 11 years, across dozens of interactions, through job changes and apartment moves, and the particular chaos of raising a child alone while working multiple jobs, she had maintained that shoebox. She had not always known what she was building. She had not started with a strategy or an endgame. She had just known, the way people who are surviving something know things without being able to fully explain how, that she might one day need proof, and she had never stopped collecting it. Holloway looked at that box for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Diane across the kitchen table. She was watching him with the same stillness she had maintained throughout all of it, and for the first time since this investigation had begun, he understood clearly and completely what he was actually looking at. Not a co-conspirator, not a woman who had chosen Raymond's side over the laws, a survivor. A woman who had been living inside a sophisticated, long-running system of coercion for 11 years and who had simultaneously, in the deepest and most private part of her life, been building the most thorough evidence file in the entire case. A woman who had said yes to a lie under the most extreme pressure a mother can be placed under, the implied threat against her child, and who had also, long before that Tuesday night in October, been preparing for the moment when the truth could finally come out. He told his team to pause the search. He sat down across from Diane. He put the shoebox on the table between them. And he said, "Ms. Carter, I think you and I need to have a very different kind of conversation than the ones we've been having." Diane looked at him for a moment, and then she said quietly, with the particular composure of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific moment to arrive, "I was wondering when you were going to figure it out." And then, for the first time in 11 years, at that kitchen table in Augusta, Georgia, with the smell of coffee in the air and Marcus's sneakers lined up at the door and the rosebush outside going brown at the edges because October had finally arrived, Diane Carter started to talk. She talked for 3 hours. She did not do it dramatically. She did not perform it. She told it the way you tell something you have been rehearsing inside your own head for so long that the act of saying it aloud has become almost straightforward, organized, sequential, precise. She started at the beginning. She went through 11 years with a clarity of detail and chronological accuracy that Holloway would later describe in his written report as remarkable and comprehensive and beyond what could reasonably be attributed to anything other than sustained, careful observation over an extended period of time. She named dates. She recalled specific conversations nearly verbatim, cross-referencing them with the written entries in the shoebox. She explained the mechanics of Raymond's control, the custody threats calibrated to just below the threshold of legal action, the insurance office incident held quietly in reserve for years, the way his demands had escalated gradually enough that each one felt like only a small step beyond the last. The shoebox, combined with Diane's testimony, gave investigators something they had not previously had, a complete, documented, first-hand account of Raymond Cole's methodology. Not just what he had done, but the precise way in which he had done it. The sequencing, the escalation, the specific language, the specific pressure points, the specific way he used a person's love for their child as the primary instrument of control. When Holloway's team went back to Cheryl Watkins and Sandra Odom with this new information, both women expanded their accounts significantly. Details they had previously held back, things they had been too frightened or too uncertain to include in earlier interviews, came forward. The case that had begun 14 months ago as a financial fraud investigation was now something considerably larger and more serious. It documented a coordinated pattern of coercion that had affected multiple women across more than a decade, and it had at its center one of the most thorough evidence records Holloway's team had ever encountered, assembled not by a trained investigator or a legal professional, but by a single mother working 3 jobs in Augusta, Georgia, who had started writing things down when her son was 14 months old, because something in her understood that one day she was going to need it. Raymond Cole was arrested on a Thursday morning in early December. He was charged with the financial fraud that had initiated the investigation 14 months earlier. He was additionally charged with witness intimidation in connection with his visits to Sandra Odom and Cheryl Watkins on that Tuesday night in October. He was charged with criminal threatening related to the pattern of coercive conduct documented across 11 years in Diane's shoebox. And a separate charge was added relating to financial harm he had caused Cheryl Watkins through a fraudulent private arrangement, an incident Cheryl had reported to police 18 months earlier and then withdrawn after Raymond came to her home unannounced, which was a visit Diane's documentation helped contextualize as part of a consistent pattern of witness intimidation rather than a coincidental event. He pled not guilty to all of it. His defense attorney was skilled and expensive, and he used the available tools. He called Diane's documentation a fabricated, strategically assembled collection of material produced by a bitter and unstable woman with a years-long personal vendetta against his client. He called Cheryl's timeline inconsistent. He called Sandra's account uncorroborated. He worked with what he had, and what he had was not enough. The jury took 4 hours. 4 hours to review 11 years. They returned guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge sentenced Raymond Cole to 11 years in federal prison, the same number of years Diane had spent maintaining the shoebox that put him there. When the judge read the sentence, a woman in the gallery behind Diane audibly exhaled. Diane herself was sitting in the front row with her hands in her lap, her back straight, her face perfectly composed. She allowed herself one small thing, so small that the person sitting beside her was not sure she had seen it correctly. Diane closed her eyes, just for a moment, just long enough to feel what it felt like when something that has been pressing against you for 11 years finally stops. Marcus Carter was 14 years old when the verdict came down. He was in the hallway outside the courtroom. Diane had not brought him inside, had not wanted him exposed to the full proceedings, had arranged for her friend Loretta to drive him there at the end, so that she would not have to face the hallway alone. He was sitting on a wooden bench with his backpack between his feet and his headphones around his neck when the doors opened and Diane walked out. He looked up at her face the way children look at their parents' faces when they are trying to read something they don't yet have full language for, careful, scanning, trying to understand what this means before deciding how to feel about it. Diane crossed the hallway and sat down beside him on that bench. She took his hand. He let her. He was 14, an age at which many boys resist that particular kind of comfort, but Marcus had always been different in that way, had always had some instinctual understanding of what his mother needed, even when he couldn't articulate it, even when he was not entirely sure what was happening. He looked at her and he said, "Mom, did we win?" And Diane looked at her son, at this boy she had made a promise to in a hospital room at 2 a.m. 14 years ago, this boy who had been shaped by everything she had silently carried, who had somehow, through all of it, become exactly who she had promised he would become. And she said, "Baby, we already won, a long time ago." He didn't fully understand what she meant. She didn't explain it right then. There would be time for that. There was finally, for the first time in 11 years, actually time for that. What Diane spent the next 2 years doing, carefully, in pieces, at the pace of what Marcus could absorb at each stage of his adolescence, was telling him the full story. She had told him only the minimum during the investigation and trial, that there was a legal situation involving his father, that it was being resolved, that he did not need to worry. She had made the decision to protect him from the details for as long as she could, and then, when he was ready, to hand it to him not as a weight, but as a story, as something that had happened, that was finished, that he could understand without having to carry it the way she had carried it. She told investigators, in a later interview, "I didn't want it to become part of his identity before he was old enough to decide what it meant. I wanted to wait until I could give it to him as something that was over, not as something he was still inside of." In the weeks after the trial, as Diane was attempting to relearn what an ordinary life felt like, what it felt like to wake up without the low, constant pressure of Raymond's existence in her calculations, Marcus came home from school one afternoon and sat at the kitchen table with an expression she recognized, the one that meant he had been turning something over in his mind for longer than he should have been doing it alone. He had seen news coverage of the trial on a friend's phone at school, because children always find the things you try to keep from them, and he had read enough of it to realize something. One of the women named in the coverage, Cheryl Watkins, was the mother of a girl in his English class, a girl named Kezia. Marcus had known Kezia Watkins since the start of 6th grade. They had sat 2 desks apart in English class for most of 2 years. He had eaten lunch in the same cafeteria, often at a table 2 rows from hers, for the better part of a semester. And their mothers had been, for all of that time, trapped inside the same man's systematic cruelty without ever knowing they were living that close to each other. Diane called Cheryl Watkins that evening. They had been introduced briefly during the investigative process, a formal, procedural introduction in a context that did not allow for much more than names and handshakes. But they had not spoken as people speak when they are beginning to understand what they actually share. This call was different, Cheryl answered, and Diane said, "I think our children go to the same school," and there was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Cheryl said quietly, "I know, Kezia told me this afternoon." They talked for 2 hours. They cried some. They laughed a little, the kind of laughter that belongs to people who have survived something together, which is not the laughter of something being funny, but the laughter of relief finding its way out through the only opening available to it. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, one of them said something about the shoebox, about documentation, about how different things might have been, not just for the 2 of them but for others, if more women had known they were not alone inside what they were inside, and had known that writing it down, dating it, keeping it, was something that could eventually matter. 6 months after that phone call, Diane and Cheryl opened a small resource operation out of a meeting room at Mount Calvary Baptist Church. They called it the Shoebox Project. Its purpose was direct, to help women in coercive or threatening situations learn to document their experiences, to record dates and words and specific incidents, to preserve the kind of evidence that investigators and courts could use when the time came. They were not lawyers. They did not have professional training in advocacy. They had something that turned out to matter more in that room, on those particular evenings, with those particular women. They knew exactly what it felt like from the inside. They had lived the documentation. They understood why it felt impossible and how to start anyway. The Shoebox Project began with 12 women in a church meeting room on a Wednesday evening in Augusta, Georgia. Within 18 months, it had worked with over 160 families. Within 2 years, it had established partner relationships with organizations in 3 Georgia counties, had been referenced in a state-level report on coercive control as an example of effective community-driven support, and had received an outreach from a legal advocacy organization in Atlanta offering pro bono partnership. A university asked if they could study the model. Diane gave them permission. She asked only that they make sure the findings were shared in language that regular people could understand and use. Marcus Carter graduated high school in the spring of 2018. He finished second in his class. He was accepted to 4 universities, the same number his mother had applied to 20 years before, a parallel that was not lost on either of them. He chose Morehouse College in Atlanta, pre-law track, with the intention of working in victim advocacy. When people asked him why he had chosen that path, he gave the same answer every time, with the directness of someone who has thought about something long enough to arrive at simplicity on the other side of complexity. Because I watched my mother protect me for 12 years with nothing but a shoebox and her own discipline, and I want to be the thing she didn't have access to. Diane Carter enrolled in an evening social work program at Augusta University. The same fall, Marcus started at Morehouse. She took 1 or 2 courses per semester, fitting them around the Shoebox Project and her work, and the ordinary, daily business of being a person with a life that had expanded significantly in the years since the trial. She was 41 when she enrolled. She was 45 when she graduated. Her mother Gloria came to the ceremony. Her brother Terrell, the one who had called her the professor when they were children, back when she walked to the library on Saturdays with a canvas bag, drove 4 hours to be there. Marcus came down from Atlanta. He took a photograph of his mother in her cap and gown standing in the afternoon sun outside the ceremony venue. He keeps it as the lock screen on his phone. Diane was asked, in the spring of 2015, to speak at a conference on coercive control in Atlanta. She drove herself there. She wore the same earrings she had worn at the trial. She stood at a podium in front of 400 people, and she told her story. All of it, from the library with the canvas bag, to the scholarship, to Raymond, to the kitchen table, to the shoebox, to the hallway bench where a 14-year-old boy had taken her hand and asked if they had won. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes. When she finished, the The room was completely silent for a moment that felt longer than it was, and then it was not. Raymond Cole served 8 of his 11 years and was released on supervised parole. He did not return to Augusta. No one in Diane's life reported seeing or hearing from him again. She does not discuss him often. When she does, it is without heat, without the energy of unfinished things. She said in one interview, 2 years after his conviction, "I'm not interested in what became of him. I'm interested in what becomes of Marcus. I'm interested in what becomes of the women we're working with. He used up enough of my time. He doesn't get any more of it." The rosebush on her front porch is still there. She replants it every few years when it needs it. Marcus asked her once why she kept maintaining it when it was so much trouble. She said it was the first thing she had ever planted that was just for her. Not practical, not for any reason except that she wanted something beautiful at her own front door. She said, "I think you have to have something that is only because you wanted it, even when everything else is about someone else." Marcus wrote that down. He still has it. Before you go, I want to ask you something real. Think about the women in your life right now. Your mother, your sister, your neighbor who always seems fine, who always says she's managing, who never asks for anything. Your coworker who comes in every morning looking put together and leaves every evening without telling anyone what she goes home to. How many of them are carrying something they have never shown a single person? How many of them have said, I'm fine, so many times, for so many years, that they have genuinely lost track of whether it's still true? How many of them are packing someone else's lunch at 10:30 at night and setting their alarm for 5:15 in the morning with no one in the world aware of what they are holding? Diane Carter's story is not unique. That is the hardest part of it to sit with when it is over. What is unique is that the shoebox existed. That somewhere in the deepest, most private part of her survival, she had the discipline to write things down, the courage to keep them across 11 years and multiple moves, and the full chaos of a life lived under pressure, and the patience to wait for a moment that she could not have known was coming, but that finally did. Most women in situations like hers do not have a shoebox. Most of them have only their own word, and the world has not always known what to do with that. This is the question I want you to carry when this is over. Not whether justice was served. It was, in this case, eventually, imperfectly, as justice almost always is. But this, if you knew someone was living inside what Diane lived inside, would you know how to see it? Would you know what to say? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what this story brought up for you. Tell us where you're watching from. We genuinely love knowing who's with us for these stories.